You've heard of career-ending injuries, but this is worse. This is about the handful of football players who have been clinically, definitively dead. 78 minutes. That is how long Fabrice Muamba's heart stopped beating. 6 is the average brain death. They survived the impossible, only to face a second silent crisis that threatened to destroy their careers forever. This is the story of the men who looked death in the eyes and returned to the pitch. We begin with a number that should be impossible. 78 minutes. That is how long Fabrice Muamba's heart stopped beating. 78 minutes. The average brain dies after 6. So how do you spend 78 minutes in clinical death and walk away intact? The answer isn't just medical. It's a brutal narrative about ignoring the first warning shot. Muamba's first near-death experience wasn't the televised collapse in 2012. It was the years before, when his underlying condition, a form of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, HCM, was slowly thickening his heart wall, turning his body's engine into a ticking bomb. He felt dizziness, fatigue, classic symptoms dismissed as the exhaustion of a high-mileage Premier League player. The body was screaming, but the game was too loud. The survival wasn't luck, it was a perfect storm of preparedness. The first payoff was the immediate, relentless CPR, a critical delay of brain death. The second was the sheer force of modern technology. 15 defibrillator shocks administered between the pitch and the hospital bed. The doctors were essentially brute forcing his heart back into a rhythm, but the physical survival set up the second, more terrifying crisis, the psychological barrier of stepping away. He lived, but the game he lived for was gone. The doctors told him unequivocally, "You can't play." He didn't lose his life, but he lost his identity. The man who survived 78 minutes of cardiac arrest had to then survive the death of his career. He chose life. That choice, that silent, agonizing walk away from the thing he loved most, was his second act of survival. Muamba's story is about the heart shutting down, but what if the body keeps fighting, even when the brain is gone? Christian Eriksen, the invisible killer. If Muamba was the precursor, Christian Eriksen's collapse in 2021 was the terrifying proof that it could happen to anyone, anywhere. Millions watched the Danish midfielder simply fall, mid-trot, his life ending right there in the Parken Stadium. The ultimate question is, how can a man who was officially dead return to the sport that killed him, and not just play, but thrive? Eriksen's survival was defined by his teammate Simon Kjær's 3 seconds of quick thinking, recognizing cardiac arrest, securing the airway, and starting CPR before the medical team even arrived. That immediate action bought the time needed for the AED, but that was just the physical payoff. The second crisis is what truly defines his courage: the ICD implantation, an implantable cardioverter defibrillator. It's a small metallic failsafe, an ever-present reminder that his heart will try to quit again. Think about that. Every time Eriksen sprints, jumps, or takes a knock, he is waiting for a machine inside his chest to zap him back to life. Every game is a high-wire act where the net is an electric shock. The challenge wasn't running, it was overriding the primal fear of that shock. It's a fear deeper than any opponent. His return wasn't just physical recovery, it was a victory over pure, paralyzing anxiety. He chose to trust the technology more than his own body's traumatic memory. He is the ultimate example of cheating death. He took the tool that saved him and turned it into the cost of admission for his second chance. But the body's vulnerabilities aren't always electrical. Therefore, we must examine the players who battled the internal decay that almost cost them everything. Thiago Silva, the silent infection. Thiago Silva, the legendary defender, did not face his crisis on the pitch. He faced it in a Russian hospital room alone, fighting a disease that should belong to the 19th century, tuberculosis. At 19, he wasn't just fighting for his life, he was given a choice that defined his entire career: remove a lobe of your lung or die in 2 weeks. His symptoms started simply: a cough, night sweats, a creeping exhaustion that his body couldn't shake. He thought it was a persistent cold, but the diagnosis revealed the horror: advanced active tuberculosis that was rapidly filling his lungs with deadly bacteria. The TB wasn't just life-threatening, it was career-ending by definition. You cannot be an elite footballer without 2 fully functioning lungs. The doctors urged him. Surgery was mandatory for survival, but Silva made an astonishing choice. He refused the surgery. Now, this was his second near-death moment, choosing to risk dying from the disease rather than living a life without football. He spent 6 grueling months in isolation, treated with powerful, relentless medication that slowly, agonizingly worked. The disease retreated, his lungs were scarred, permanently weakened but intact. He gambled his life on the chance to play again, surviving the medical death sentence through sheer will. But the victory wasn't automatic. The second psychological crisis was retraining a body that had essentially been chemically poisoned and starved of oxygen for half a year. Every sprint, every jump was a fight against the diminished capacity of his scarred lungs. He had to be smarter, fitter, and more mentally resolute than ever before. The ultimate payoff? Thiago Silva became one of the greatest defenders of his generation, playing well into his late 30s at the highest level. The man who was told he had to lose a lung to live became a Champions League winner. He didn't just survive, he used the memory of his near death as a fuel source. But not every story of a hidden killer has a triumphant ending. Therefore, we must talk about the player whose crisis gave us no second chances. Antonio Puerta, the brain bomb. For all the success stories, the risk remains. Antonio Puerta was a young, explosive talent for Sevilla, a symbol of potential. On a humid night in 2007, he did what Muamba and Eriksson did. He fell, but the cause was a silent executioner that offered no warnings. A congenital heart defect coupled with repeated sudden ventricular fibrillation. Puerta collapsed twice in quick succession. He was revived on the pitch, seemingly coherent, and walked off under his own power. That walk was his first temporary victory, but the damage was done. The lack of oxygen during the collapse had triggered irreversible brain damage, leading to his definitive fall in the locker room tunnel. This story is vital because it proves that survival is a razor's edge. Despite immediate aid, the underlying condition, the electrical anomaly in his heart, was too swift, too brutal. He was kept alive for 3 days in the hospital, but the medical crisis of multi-organ failure due to the initial oxygen deprivation was too severe. Puerta's story is the chilling, necessary reminder that not everyone gets the AED miracle. His legacy is not his return, but the intensity of the medical research that followed, trying to find a test that could detect the undetectable. He is the ghost that pushes every medical team to be faster, to be better, to look for the next invisible threat. Puerta's life ended with his final collapse. But what about the player who suffered a literal life-altering impact, who carried his scars outwardly for the rest of his career? Petr Cech, the skull fracture. Petr Cech, the helmet. Everyone sees the headgear and thinks of protection. They forget that the helmet is a walking trophy of survival from the most brutal impact trauma in modern football. The question is, why did a simple accidental knee to the head become a near-fatal event? The impact fractured his skull in 4 places, but the real killer was the epidural hematoma, blood pooling aggressively outside the brain, causing massive pressure. This pressure kills in minutes. Cech was lucky to have a neurosurgeon nearby who could perform an emergency craniotomy, drilling into his skull to relieve the pressure and evacuate the clot. He was saved not on the pitch, but by the emergency transport and the speed of the hospital team. He survived the fracture, but the return, the second crisis, was a battle waged entirely in his head. The helmet is his physical shield, but what about the invisible one? Post-concussion syndrome. Head trauma leaves a residue of neurological anxiety. For a goalkeeper whose job relies on total, split-second instinctual trust in their body, this is a crisis of confidence. Every corner, every aerial duel, every time he rushed out at an attacker, he had to silence the deep, visceral fear that a second, smaller knock would be fatal. He couldn't just play football. He had to constantly manage the psychological minefield of his own mortality. He had to be braver than anyone else on the pitch, knowing that one wrong move meant death or permanent disability. His 2 greatest victories weren't the saves. They were his choice to trust his body, to trust the doctors, and most importantly, to trust that the game would not claim him a second time. Cech went on to win major trophies, to his talent, but to a will forged in the fires of life-threatening trauma. Kevin Malquit, the outlier. We've talked about the heart and the head, but there is a different kind of near-death experience, one that haunts the locker room. The rare career-ending bacterial infection. This is the story of Kevin Malquit, whose life was threatened not by a ball or a body, but by a microscopic assassin. Malquit, a defender for Napoli, suffered a nasty tear of his anterior cruciate ligament, ACL, a common injury. But the routine surgery went wrong. A severe staphylococcus bacterial infection took root in his knee, an infection so aggressive it began eating away at the joint, threatening not just his career, but his leg itself. The stakes escalated from from a 6-month injury to a possible amputation. His first near-death experience was the septic shock, the fever, the excruciating pain, the body's frantic response to the infection. Doctors fought relentlessly with powerful antibiotics, knowing that if the bacteria reached his bloodstream, it was game over. He survived the infection, barely, but the second crisis was the price of survival. 5 further surgeries to clean out the infection and rebuild the ravaged knee joint. The medical death was averted, but the physical death of his career seemed inevitable. He spent over 400 days in recovery, watching his teammates from a hospital bed, his body a collection of surgical scars and failing tissue. The challenge was not to survive, but to rebuild a professional-grade knee from the ground up, fighting off the psychological depression that accompanies such a long, brutal recovery. He had to prove to himself and to the world that his legs, which had almost been amputated, could still carry the weight of a professional career. He had to learn how to walk, then run, then cut all over again. This is the ultimate test of resilience. It is not the sudden drama of cardiac arrest. It is the slow, grinding psychological war of rebuilding a body that betrayed you from the inside out. He eventually returned to the pitch, a minor miracle proving that the will to play can defeat even the most aggressive bacterial assassin. We have looked into the dark moments, the 78 minutes of silence, the terrifying beep of the ICD, the crushing pressure of the hematoma, the silent decay of disease. These men didn't just survive, they took their most profound vulnerability, the moment their body failed them, and turned it into their ultimate superpower. They stepped back onto the pitch not as survivors, but as defiers. Football is not just a game of skill, it is a game of defiance, a testament to the absurd, beautiful courage it takes to look death in the eyes and say, "Not today, and maybe not ever again." They are the living, breathing proof that the line between a professional athlete and a miracle is razor thin. And in that second chance, they didn't just find life, they found something more valuable, an unbreakable will.